Hey everyone, welcome to another Patreon topic video. This one is for Kay, and the topic is the different types of shmup difficulty, where some shmups can be difficult, but in different ways than other games, right? So having trouble in Gradius 3, Gradius 2, sometimes is not going to feel the same as having trouble in a Toho game or having trouble in a cave game, or even a Psycho game. So what makes shmups difficult in different ways? I think that's an actually really interesting topic because I feel like there are some players I've seen out there like Jamers and Pearl and Plasmo, for instance, who seem to excel in all sorts of different styles of shmups. They can play old ones, they can play new ones. And then there's players like myself who basically can do pretty dang well in Danmaku games and even a little bit well in Toho games. But you start putting me in those classic shmups like Gradius and R-Type, and that's where I start to really struggle and get frustrated. So why is that? Why are these skills not exactly 100% transferable between the subtypes of the games? And I think it's just the raw matter is sometimes these games test different parts of a player's skill set, right? And there's actually certain skills that maybe Danmaku games never really test that classic shmups test very frequently, and the other way around, right? So I guess let's start with talking about classic shmups and my difficulty with what I find difficult about classic shmups. The first part that I find difficult about classic shmups is maneuvering the ships and playing in horizontal rather than vertical. Many classic shmups are actually horizontal games rather than vertical games, and just the change in orientation alone is enough for me to be, okay, this is an adjustment. And then also you start to have to factor in how classic shmups work, and the way they're designed level-wise is actually fairly different than how Danmaku games are designed. For instance, I kind of talked about this before in another video, but I feel like classic shmups, the enemies are actually trying to hit you. They're aiming at you to hit you, and they're going to come fast, and they're going to spawn and trap you, and you have to be on your toes. Whereas in Danmaku games, I feel like a lot of the enemies aren't necessarily trying to hit you right away. They're just trying to push you around the screen and force you into a corner and trap you where you get walled out. Especially cave games, that's kind of their MO. Or even Toho games where they're just throwing these kind of obvious patterns at you, and they're just saying, can you dodge this? Can you not dodge this? Whereas in classic shmups, like I've been playing a bunch of UN Squadron trying to get good at that game. And the funny thing about classic shmups like UN Squadron is they are definitely hard, but it's kind of difficult to pinpoint where exactly this difficulty is coming from. In cave games, it kind of feels like, for me, I can identify, okay, these patterns are just really hard to maneuver through. The bullet speeds are getting increasingly fast. I'm getting flanked. Whereas in something like UN Squadron, I never feel like the game's, what it's asking of me is beyond what my hands and brain are able to comprehend. But there's just so much to keep track of and be aware of and to memorize that I often find myself getting trapped. And also I think too, classic shmups play with a lot of different dynamics that you don't really run into in bullet hells. For instance, power-up dynamics. Power-ups seem to be a much more important factor of classic shmups, and I have heard players who like these style of games more comment that they feel like it's a shame that modern shmups like Danmaku games have kind of foregone the power-up systems of the past for the most part. Where in something like Gradius, even Raiden, like power-up management, figuring out when to power up, what to upgrade, using it for your routing, that's all pretty important. Whereas in cave games, just pick up the power-up items and basically good to go, right? And don't bomb. So that's another interesting dynamic. It's just, I think classic shmups experimented a lot more with weapon systems and items and all those sorts of things. And so that's part of the difficulty of the games, is you have to learn those systems and master them. Whereas, myself, I feel like a lot of bullet hell games really just emphasize the fundamentals of dodging stuff and managing enemy patterns. And so you I'm a little bit of a, I don't know what you call it, a hipster or something when I come into some of these classic games where I'm like, I don't need to bomb, I don't need to manage weapons, I'll just raw dodge and shoot my way through this game, and sometimes that just doesn't work. UN Squadron's a great example of that. You need to figure out when to use your bombs, when to use your special weapons, and all those sorts of things. Another big difficulty difference between the two is hitboxes and figuring out how to maneuver your hitboxes in different games. And both of them are an art. It's just you have to learn a different skill for each one. So for bullet hell shmups, it's all about learning to squeeze this tiny little hitbox through waves and waves of, bullets and enemies, and you're just trying to micro your way through all this. And basically, your hitbox is smaller. There's more stuff flying at it, but you have a more precise thing to focus on that you can maneuver around and get around and stuff. Whereas in more classic style shmups, that big old hitbox, there's less stuff coming at you, but it's usually flying at you faster, and the hitbox is usually kind of weird shaped or hard to totally understand. So I feel like it's actually, I don't know which one's more challenging, honestly, learning to navigate fast patterns with a big chunky hitbox, or to learn to navigate through dense, thick patterns with a mini little, dense, slow patterns with a mini little micro hitbox. I think both can be equally difficult depending on the game and level design. It's just what skill are you equipped to use, right? And that's something I really struggle with. Even in classic shmups that tend to have a smaller hitbox, like Gradius, UN Squadron has a pretty small hitbox as well. I still find myself trying to micro through patterns, and the game's like, no, you can't micro through this pattern, boy. And so, I think also classic shmups, I've found tend to sort of emphasize macro dodging more often than Danmaku games, right? So, you're going to macro dodge a lot more in classic shmups, and it's a habit I needed to break when I started, especially even like Psycho games, you macro dodge a lot more. So if you go from a lot of Toho and Cave where you're microing through all these patterns, and then you throw yourself into a Psycho game or Gradius or something, and you're trying to micro through these patterns, it's not going to work. I think another interesting difference between classic shmups and bullet hell shmups that makes the difficulty a different skill is that in classic shmups, with a lot of boss fights, it's a lot of setup and anticipation and quick attacks and quick dodges, right? Where you set up, even in Batrider actually, it doesn't have to be that old of a shmup. You have to set up, you have to know the pattern, then you have to just quick move. Whereas in bullet hell shmups, what the bosses do is they just try and trick you and maneuver you and throw more intricate mazes of bullets or intersecting patterns. For instance, think about in Batrider the first two bosses, and then think about the first two bosses in DOJ, right? There's actually a very big difference of how those enemies attack you. Like I said, most of DOJ attacks from the bosses aren't directly aimed at you to hit you. It's more like they're just throwing all this stuff all over the screen, and you just have to dodge through it like a crazy person, right? Whereas in a lot of classic shmups, not always, but a lot of them, the boss is actually trying to just nail you with something, and it's usually like you have just these quick, precise movements you have to do to get through the enemy attacks. I also feel like classic shmups tend to, in my opinion, actually tend to test your reflexes a little more than bullet hell shmups. Because bullet hell shmups, your reflexes, it's usually how quickly you can read the pattern and navigate your way through it. Of course, when you get into more difficult sections, it does come down to just some straight up reflex dodging. But most of the time, actually, if you have some kind of route and you're able to read the pattern quickly, your reflexes don't come into play as often. Whereas I feel like in classic shmups, some of the boss fights will just have these really quick wind-ups for their attacks, and then they'll just fire at you, right? And so I almost feel like classic shmups do test your reflexes a little more heavily than newer shmups. Some other observations that I've found just between the two is I feel like classic shmups tend to be a little more brutal, right, for survival as far as punishing mistakes than later shmups. For instance, in Donanpachi, scoring-wise, a death it's over, man. The scoring, it's brutal. However, survival-wise, if you die in Donanpachi, for the most part, you'll be fine. You get a bunch of bombs. You can recharge your shots usually pretty quickly. You don't get that Gradius syndrome where you die in a certain section and then you're just trapped there because you don't have power-ups, and then maybe you get checkpointed back and you have to crawl your way back through these awful sections with no ship speed. That's another thing about classic shmups, that the difficulty for survival is, I think, more hard in a way than the difficulty for bullet hells. But usually in classic shmups, survival is much more closely tied to scoring, right? Whereas in bullet hells and later shmups, like, the scoring is like its own thing usually that relates to survival, honestly, but they're not like super tied together. Where there are some classic shmups where it's basically just how much crap can you kill on the screen is your score, right? And just optimizing, killing everything. So that is another interesting difference. Some other things about the two that I found difficult, because I do struggle with classic shmups much more so than bullet hells, and I know there's a lot of people who are inverse to that. Another thing I find difficult about classic shmups is they're very momentum based, and honestly can be pretty frustrating at times for me, because Gradius is a great example of this. You get all your power ups, you got all the attack power, you got the good speed, you're doing really well, and you're navigating through patterns and everything, and then you get clipped by something, and the bullet speeds are so fast, and some of the sections can be really hectic, and so you get clipped, and then it's like you get checkpointed back, and your momentum's completely gone, and there's times where I just reset the run. I'm like, forget it, I'm not trying to crawl back here. So I guess what I'm saying is that recovery, especially in later stages in classic shmups, can be horrible experiences. Whereas in like I said, in Danmaku games, recovering usually isn't that bad, right? Survival-wise, you can most of the time pick up your power-ups again, if you die in the right way, right? Like in Grega, if you die at the top of the screen, your items fly everywhere. You can actually just fly in and pick up your items, whereas in a Gradius, that's not a thing. So I think you might be able to retrieve your options in some of the Gradius games. Yeah, forgive me for not quite remembering, but I think you might be able to retrieve some of your options. So I guess the games that I think, just really quick, that I want to improve at as a player overall are Blazing Star. That's a classic shmup I really want to get better at. Gradius games, another one. Maybe even something like R-Type. R-Type is the one that I really struggle to connect with. I know a lot of players really like those games, and I struggle, man. Just the speed and the pacing and the styling is just so opposite of what I'm usually looking for, but I want to kind of brush up and get better at those games as well. Get a little more well-rounded as a player. So I hope this was what Kay was looking for. And so before we head out, I'll thank my patrons: Dingo, Anthony A, Ben Nigan, Brian Shiver, Double Vision, Dunpill 2064, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Gus, Kiwi, Jacob Spring, Jake Ryan, Joe Angelo, John, Kay, Kinotosi, and Kay's the man of the video, Quentin, Mark Sloan, Maz, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Okla Kugels, okay, I think that's right, Okla Kugels, Omcall, Psych, Rhizosis, Segumo, Plasmo, Young Money Sui, and Yuta Kaja. Thanks so much for watching.